my turn to talk.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. You're very welcome. We are allowing for people to arrive from all corners of the world. We are very happy to be gathering today for the last meeting, the 8th meeting of this reading seminar organized by ICLO-NLS. There's 95 of us at the moment. We receive good mornings in various languages. We have people joining us from all over Europe and beyond. So welcome everybody. It's quite hard to believe that we started 10 weeks ago during the month of March. We put together this initiative. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Joanne Conway, Susan McFeely, and Linda Clarke, the Bureau of the Irish Circle of the Lacanian Orientation of the New Lacanian School, for having received and supported this project back in March, when we had a very little idea of what was going to unfold. I'm very happy to welcome Linda Clarke, who is going to do the reading of the last chapter of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, chapter 8, and also to welcome once again Thomas Svolos, joining us at 4:35 a.m. in the United States, in Omaha. So for the second time to do a commentary on this chapter. The idea with this initiative was to give ourselves a platform where to continue, while at the same time acknowledging what was happening, to continue our engagement and our commitment to psychoanalysis, each one from each one's own place. And I'm not talking about geographical place. Our relationship to psychoanalysis is, of course, a singular one. And I'm particularly moved by the fact that we've been joined over this last weeks, months, by people coming from a great diversity of backgrounds, of connections to psychoanalysis in universities, in education, in cultural studies, in sociology, mental health, whichever your relationship to psychoanalysis is. I think we've all realized that we can't skip reading Freud. It's something that has to be done. And if it can be done in a joyful way, as I think we've managed to do over the last 2 months, even better. So I'm very happy to welcome you all. I'm going to make a couple of announcements before giving the floor to Linda. You're all invited to join us for the next series of events organized by ICLO. The next one is The Fall of the Other, a seminar where we have the privilege to count on the presence of the incoming president of the New Lacanian School, Alexander Stevens. Also our dear colleague, Alan Rowan, who I'm sure is there now and who is based in Berlin. And another dear colleague, Howard Rouse, who is based in Barcelona. That's on the 13th of June at 11 a.m. Dublin time. There is another series of reading seminars that will start on the 20th of June, conducted by Rick Lose, Alan Rowan, and myself, in an attempt to, I don't know if this expression exists in English, but to take up the glove of this series and continue reading Freud. We called that seminar The Freudian Instances and Ours. So it's a Lacanian reading of Freud's The Ego and the Id. I think those who participated of this civilization and its discontents will notice how different it is, having engaged already with this text, to go to another seminal work of Freud. That's going to last three meetings, giving 2 weeks in between so that people have a chance to read the text. Also, I'm very pleased to let you know that today, at some point during the day, you will find a surprise, a gift from this civilization and its discontents in your inbox. So check your emails later today, and I hope you enjoy that little surprise that we prepared for you. Without further ado, Linda, we'll listen to your reading.
Okay, thank you, Florencia. And just on my own behalf, I want to say thank you very much to Florencia for this wonderful initiative, which came at a very particular moment for us all, I think. So, and I suppose I was reflecting on the last 7 meetings, and I suppose, to borrow the words of or paraphrase Eric Laurent, if one can do such a thing, it reminded me that psychoanalysis is not an exact science. If it were, we would no longer have anything to learn from Freud, as the last word would have already have been said. And I suppose as these last 7 meetings have demonstrated, indeed the last word has not been said. So together, let's listen to what Freud has to say in the final chapter. Chapter 8. Having reached the end of his journey, the author must ask his readers' forgiveness for not having been a more skillful guide and for not having spared them empty stretches of road and troublesome detours. There is no doubt that it could have been done better. I will attempt, late in the day, to make some amends. In the first place, I suspect that the reader has the impression that our discussions on the sense of guilt disrupt the framework of this essay, that they take up too much space so that the rest of its subject matter, with which they are not always closely connected, is pushed to one side. This may have spoiled the structure of my paper, but it corresponds faithfully to my intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Anything that still sounds strange about this statement, which is the final conclusion of our investigation, can probably be traced to the quite peculiar relationship, as yet completely unexplained, with the sense of guilt, which the sense of guilt has to our consciousness. In the common case of remorse, which we regard as normal, this feeling makes itself clearly enough perceptible to consciousness. Indeed, we are accustomed to speak of a consciousness of guilt instead of a sense of guilt. Our study of the neuroses, to which, after all, we owe the most valuable pointers to an understanding of normal conditions, brings us up against some contradictions. In one of those affections, obsessional neurosis, the sense of guilt makes itself noisily heard in consciousness. It dominates the clinical picture and the patient's life as well, and it hardly allows anything else to appear alongside of it. But in most other cases and forms of neurosis, it remains completely unconscious, without on that account producing any less important effects. Our patients do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious sense of guilt to them. In order to make ourselves at all intelligent to them, we tell them of an unconscious need for punishment, in which the sense of guilt finds expression. But its connection with a particular form of neurosis must not be overestimated. Even in obsessional neurosis, there are types of patients who are not aware of their sense of guilt, or who only feel it as a tormenting uneasiness, a kind of anxiety, if they are prevented from carrying out certain actions. It ought to be possible, eventually, to understand these things, but as yet we cannot. Here, perhaps, we may be glad to have it pointed out that the sense of guilt is at bottom nothing else but a topographical variety of anxiety. In its later phases, it coincides completely with fear of the superego. And the relations of anxiety to consciousness exhibit the same extraordinary variations. Anxiety is always present somewhere or other behind every symptom. But at one time, it takes noisy possession of the whole of consciousness, while at another, it conceals itself so completely that we are obliged to speak of unconscious anxiety, or if we want to have a clearer psychological conscience, since anxiety is, in the first instance, simply a feeling of possibilities of anxiety. Consequently, it is very conceivable that the sense of guilt produced by civilization is not perceived as such either, and remains to a large extent unconscious, or appears as a sort of malaise, a dissatisfaction for which people seek other motivations. Religions, at any rate, have never overlooked the part played in civilization by a sense of guilt. Furthermore, a point which I fail to appreciate elsewhere, they claim to redeem mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. From the manner in which, in Christianity, this redemption is achieved by the sacrificial death of a single person, who in this manner takes upon himself a guilt that is common to everyone, we've been able to infer what the first occasion may have been on which this primal guilt, which was also the beginning of civilization, was acquired. Though it cannot be of great importance, it may not be superfluous to elucidate the meaning of a few words such as superego, conscience, sense of guilt, need for punishment, and remorse, which we have often, perhaps, used too loosely and interchangeably. They all relate to the same state of affairs, but denote different aspects of it. The superego is an agency which has been inferred by us, and conscience is a function which we ascribe, among other functions, to that agency. This function consists in keeping a watch over the actions and intentions of the ego and judging them, in exercising a censorship. The sense of guilt, the harshness of the superego, is thus the same thing as the severity of the conscience. It is the perception which the ego has of being watched over in this way, the assessment of the tension between its own strivings and the demands of the superego. The fear of this critical agency, a fear which is at the bottom of the whole relationship, the need for punishment, is an instinctual manifestation on the part of the ego, which has become masochistic under the influence of a sadistic superego. It is a portion, that is to say, of the instinct towards internal destruction present in the ego, employed for forming an erotic attachment to the superego. We ought not to speak of a conscience until a superego is demonstrably present. As to a sense of guilt, we must admit that it is in its existence before the superego, and therefore before conscience too. At that time, it is the immediate expression of fear of the external authority, a recognition of the tension between the ego and that authority. It is the direct derivative of the conflict between the need for the authority's love and the urge towards instinctual satisfaction, whose inhibition produces the inclination to aggression. The superimposition of these two strata of the sense of guilt, one coming from fear of the external authority and the other from the fear of internal authority, has hampered our insight into the position of conscience in a number of ways. Remorse is a general term for the ego's reaction in a case of sense of guilt. It contains, in little altered form, the sensory material of the anxiety, which is operating behind the sense of guilt. It is itself a punishment and can include the need for punishment. Thus, remorse too can be older than conscience. Nor will it do any harm if we once more review the contradictions which have for a while perplexed us during our inquiry. Thus, at one point, the sense of guilt was the consequent of acts of aggression that has been abstained from. But at another point, and precisely at its historical beginning, the killing of the father, it was the consequent of an act of aggression that had been carried out. But a way out of this difficulty was found, for the institution of the internal authority, the superego, altered the situation radically. Before this, the sense of guilt coincided with remorse. We may remark incidentally that the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after an act of aggression has actually been carried out. After this, owing to the omniscience of the superego, the difference between an aggression intended and an aggression carried out lost its force. Henceforward, a sense of guilt could be produced not only by an act of violence that is actually carried out, as all the word knows, but also by one that is merely intended, as psychoanalysis has discovered. Irrespectively of this alteration in the psychological situation, the conflict arising from ambivalence, the conflict between the two primal instincts, leaves the same result behind. we are tempted to look here for the solution of the problem of the varying relation in which the sense of guilt stands to consciousness. It might be thought that a sense of guilt arising from remorse for an evil deed must always be conscious, whereas a sense of guilt arising for the perception of evil impulse may remain unconscious. But the answer is not so simple as that. Obsessional neurosis speaks energetically against it. The second contradiction concerned the aggressive energy with which we suppose the superego to be endowed. According to one view, that energy merely carries on the punitive energy of the external authority and keeps it alive in the mind, while according to another view, it consists, on the contrary, of one's own aggressive energy, which has not been used and which one now directs against the inhibiting authority. The first view seemed to fit in better with the history, and the second with the theory of the sense of guilt. Closer reflection has resolved this apparently irreconcilable contradiction almost too completely. What remained as essential and common factor was that in each case, we were dealing with aggressiveness, which has been displaced inwards. Clinical observation, moreover, allows us in fact to distinguish two sources for the aggressiveness, which we attribute to the superego. One or the other of them exercises stronger effect in any given case, but as a general rule, they operate in unison. This, I think, the place at which to put forward for serious consideration a view which I've been earlier recommended for provisional acceptance. In the most recent analytic literature, a predilection is shown for the idea that any kind of frustration, any thwarted instinctual satisfaction, results or may result in a heightening of the sense of guilt. A great theoretical simplification will, I think, be achieved if we regard this as applying only to the aggressive instincts, and little will be found to contradict this assumption. For how are we to account on dynamic and economic grounds for an increase in the sense of guilt appearing in place of an unfulfilled erotic demand? This only seems possible in a roundabout way if we suppose, that is, that the prevention of an erotic satisfaction calls up a piece of aggressiveness against the person who has interfered with the satisfaction, and that this aggressiveness has itself to be suppressed in turn. But if this is so, it is after all the only aggressiveness which is transformed into a sense of guilt by being suppressed and made over to the superego. I'm convinced that many processes will admit of a simpler and clearer exposition if the findings of psychoanalysis with regard to the derivation of the sense of guilt are restricted to the aggressive instincts. Examination of the clinical material gives us no unequivocal answer here, because, as our hypothesis tells us, the two classes of instinct hardly ever appear in a pure form, isolated from each other, but an investigation of extreme cases would probably point in the direction I anticipate. I am tempted to extract the first advantage from this more restricted view of the case by applying it to the process of repression. As we have learned, neurotic symptoms are, in their essence, substituted satisfaction for unfulfilled sexual wishes. In the course of our analytic work, we've discovered to our surprise that perhaps every neurosis conceals a quota of unconscious sense of guilt, which in its turn fortifies the symptoms by making use of them as a punishment. It now seems plausible to formulate the following proposition. When an instinctual trend undergoes repression, its libidinal elements are turned into symptoms and its aggressive components into a sense of guilt. Even if this proposition is only an average approximation to the truth, it is worthy of our interest. Some readers of this work may further have an impression that they've heard the formula of the struggle between eros and the death instinct too often. It was alleged to characterize the process of civilization which mankind undergoes, but it also brought into connection with the development of the individual. And in addition, it was said to have revealed the secret of organic life in general. We cannot, I think, avoid going into the relations of these three processes to one another. The repetition of the same formula is justified by the consideration that both the process of human civilization and of the development of the individual are also vital processes, which is to say that they must share in the most general characteristic of life. On the other hand, evidence of the presence of this general characteristic fails, for the very reason of its general nature, to help us to arrive at any differentiation between the processes, so long as it is not narrowed down by special qualifications. We can only be satisfied, therefore, if we assert that the process of civilization is a modification which the vital process experiences under the influence of a task that is set it by eros and instigated by ananke, by the exigencies of reality, and that this task is one of uniting separate individuals into a community bound together by libidinal ties. When, however, we look at the relation between the process of human civilization and the developmental or educative process of the individual human beings, we shall conclude without too much hesitation that the two are very similar in nature, if not the very same process applied to different kinds of object. The process of the civilization of the human species is, of course, an abstraction of a higher order than is the development of the individual, and it is therefore harder to apprehend in concrete terms, nor should we pursue analogies to an obsessional extreme, but in view of the similarity between the aims of the two processes. In the one case, the integration of a separate individual into a human group, and in the other case, the creation of a unified group out of many individuals. We cannot be surprised at the similarity between the means employed and the resultant phenomena. In view of its exceptional importance, we must not long postpone the mention of one feature which distinguishes between the two processes. In the developmental process of the individual, the program of the pleasure principle, which consists in finding the satisfaction of happiness, is retained as the main aim. Integration in, or adaptation to, a human community appears as a scarcely avoidable condition which must be fulfilled before this aim of happiness can be achieved. If it could be done without that condition, it would perhaps be preferable. To put it in other words, the development of the individual seems to us to be a product of the interaction between two urges. The urge towards happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge towards union with others in the community, which we call altruistic. Neither of these descriptions goes much below the surface. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the main accent falls mostly on the egoistic urge, or the urge towards happiness, while the other urge, which may be described as a cultural one, is usually content with the role of imposing restrictions. But in the process of civilization, things are different. Here, by far, the most important thing is the aim of creating a unity out of the individual human beings. It is true that the aim of happiness is still there, but it is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if the creation of a human community would be most successful if no attention had to be paid to the happiness of the individual. The developmental process of the individual can thus be expected to have special features of its own, which are not reproduced in the process of human civilization. It is only insofar as the first of these processes has union with the community as its aim that it need coincide with the second process. Just as a planet revolves around a central body, as well as rotating on its own axis, so the human individual takes part in the course of development of mankind, at the same time as he pursues his own path in life. But to our dull eyes, the play of forces in the heavens seems fixed in a never-changing order. In the field of organic life, we can still see how the forces contend with one another, and how the effects of the conflict are continually changing. So also, the two urges, the one towards personal happiness and the other towards union with the other human beings, must struggle with each other in every individual. And so also, the two processes of individual and of cultural development must stand in hostile opposition to each other and mutually dispute the ground. But this struggle between the individual and society is not a derivative of the contradiction, probably an irreconcilable one, between the primal instincts of eros and death. It is a dispute in the economics of libido, comparable to the contest concerning the distribution of libido between ego and objects. And it does admit of an eventual accommodation in the individual, as it may be hoped it will also do in the future of civilization, however much that civilization may oppress the life of the individual today. The analogy between the process of civilization and the path of the individual development may be extended in an important respect. It can be asserted that the community, too, evolves a superego under whose influence cultural development proceeds. It would be a tempting task for anyone who has a knowledge of human civilizations to follow out this analogy in detail. I will confine myself to bringing forward a few striking points. The superego of an epoch of civilization has an origin similar to that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind by the personalities of great leaders, men of overwhelming force of mind, or men in whom one of the human impulsions has found its strongest and purest, and therefore often its most one-sided expression. In many instances, the analogy goes still further, in that during their lifetime, these figures were often enough, even if not always, mocked and maltreated by others, and even dispatched in a cruel fashion. In the same way, indeed, the primal father did not attain divinity until long after he had met his death by violence. The most arresting example of this fateful conjunction is to be seen in the figure of Jesus Christ, if indeed that figure is not part of mythology, which called it into being from an obscure memory of that primal event. Another point of agreement between the cultural and the individual superego is that the former, just like the latter, sets up strict, ideal demands, disobedience to which is visited with fear of conscience. Here, indeed, we come across the remarkable circumstance that the mental processes concerned are actually more familiar to us and more accessible to the consciousness as they are seen in the group than they can be in the individual man. In him, when tension arises, it is only the aggressiveness of the superego which, in the form of reproaches, makes itself noisily heard. Its actual demands often remain unconscious in the background. If we bring them to conscious knowledge, we find that they coincide with the precepts of the prevailing cultural superego. At this point, the two processes, that of the cultural development of the group and that of the cultural development of the individual, are, as it were, always interlocked. For that reason, some of the manifestations and properties of the superego can be more easily detected in its behavior in the cultural community than in the separate individual. The cultural superego has developed its ideals and set up its demands. Among the latter, those which deal with the relations of human beings to one another are comprised under the heading of ethics. People have at all times set the greatest value on ethics, as though they expected that it in particular would produce especially important results. And it does in fact deal with a subject which can easily be recognized as the sorest spot in every civilization. Ethics is thus to be regarded as a therapeutic attempt, as an endeavor to achieve, by means of a command of the superego, something which has so far not been achieved by means of any other cultural activities. As we already know, the problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. And for that very reason, we are especially interested in what is probably the most recent of the cultural commands of the superego, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. In our research into and therapy of a neurosis, we are led to make two reproaches against the superego of the individual. In the severity of its commands and prohibitions, it troubles itself too little about the happiness of the ego, in that it takes insufficient account of the resistances against obeying them, of the instinctual strength of the id in the first place, and of the difficulties presented by the real external environment in the second. Consequently, we are very often obliged for the therapeutic purposes to oppose the superego, and we endeavor to lower its demands. Exactly the same objections can be made against the ethical demands of the cultural superego. It too does not trouble itself enough about the facts of the mental constitution of human beings. It issues a command and does not ask whether it is possible for people to obey it. On the contrary, it assumes that a man's ego is psychologically capable of anything that is required of it, that his ego has unlimited mastery over his id. This is a mistake, and even in what are known as normal people, the id cannot be controlled beyond certain limits. If more is demanded of a man, a revolt will be produced in him, or a neurosis, or he will be made unhappy. The commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, is the strongest offense against human aggressiveness and an excellent example of the unpsychological proceedings of the cultural superego. The commandment is impossible to fulfill. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value, not get rid of the difficulty. Civilization pays no attention to all this. It merely admonishes us that the harder it is to obey the precept, the more meritorious it is to do so. But anyone who follows such a precept in present-day civilization only puts himself at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the person who disregards it. What a potent obstacle to civilization aggressiveness must be if the defense against it can cause as much happiness as the aggressiveness itself. Natural ethics, as it is called, has nothing to offer here except the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to think oneself better than others. At this point, the ethics based on religion introduces its promises of a better afterlife. But so long as virtue is not rewarded here on earth, ethics will, I fancy, preach in vain. I too think it quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical commands. But the recognition of this fact among socialists has been obscured and made useless for practical purposes by a fresh idealistic misconception of human nature. I believe the line of thought which seeks to trace in the phenomena of cultural development the part played by a superego promises still further discoveries. I hasten to come to a close, but there is one question which I can hardly evade. if the development of civilization has such a far-reaching similarity to the development of the individual, and if it employs the same methods, may we not be justified in reaching the diagnosis that under the influence of cultural urges, some civilizations or some epochs of civilization, possibly the whole of mankind, have become neurotic? An analytic dissection of such neuroses might lead to therapeutic recommendations, which could lay claim to great practical interest. I would not say that an attempt of this kind to carry psychoanalysis over to the cultural community was absurd or doomed to be fruitless. But we should have to be very cautious and not forget that, after all, we are only dealing with analogies, and that it is dangerous, not only with men, but also with concepts, to tear them from the sphere in which they have originated and have been evolved. Moreover, the diagnosis of communal neuroses is faced with a special difficulty. In an individual neurosis, we take as our starting point the contrast that distinguishes the patient from his environment, which is assumed to be normal. For a group, all of whose members are affected by one and the same disorder, no such background could exist. It would have to be found elsewhere. And as regards the therapeutic application of our knowledge, what would be the use of the most correct analysis of social neurosis, since no one possesses authority to impose such a therapy upon the group? But in spite of all these difficulties, we may expect that one day someone will venture to embark upon a pathology of cultural communities. For a wide variety of reasons, it is very far from my intention to express an opinion upon the value of human civilization. I have endeavored to guard myself against the enthusiastic prejudice which holds that our civilization is the most precious thing that we possess or could acquire, and that its path will be necessarily led to heights of unimagined perfection. I can at least listen without indignation to the critic who is of the opinion that when one surveys the aims of cultural endeavour and the means it employs, one is bound to come to the conclusion that the whole effort is not worth the trouble, and that the outcome of it can only be a state of affairs which the individual will be unable to tolerate. My impartiality is made all the easier to me by my knowing very little about all these things. One thing only do I know for certain, and that is that man's judgment of value follow directly his wishes for happiness, that accordingly they are an attempt to support his illusions with arguments. I should find it very understandable if someone were to point out the obligatory nature of the course of human civilization and were to say, for instance, that the tendencies to a restriction of sexual life or to the institution of a humanitarian ideal at the expense of natural selection were developmental trends which cannot be averted or turned aside, and to which it is best for us to yield, as though they were necessities of nature. I know too the objection that can be made against this, to the effect that in the history of mankind, trends such as these, which were considered insurmountable, have often been thrown aside and replaced by other trends. Thus, I have not the courage to rise up before my fellow men as a prophet, and I bow to their reproach that I can offer them no consolation. For at bottom, that is what they're all demanding. The wildest revolutionaries, no less passionately than the most virtuous believers. The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect, precisely, the present time deserves a special interest. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help, they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current unrest, their unhappiness, and their mood of anxiety. And now it is to be expected that the other two of the heavenly powers, eternal Eros, will make an effort to assert himself in the struggle with his equally immortal adversary. But who can foresee with what success and with what result?
Okay. Thank you very much, Linda. It's a chapter that inevitably resonates with many of the attempts we're doing to put words on the current state of the world, I'm sure. So I will now hand over to Thomas, and we look forward to his commentary.
Thank you, Linda, for the reading. Thank you, Florencia, and your transitional remarks there about commentary on the current state of the world are exactly what's going to inform my remarks here today. When I was granted this wonderful opportunity to participate in this meeting, I ended up deciding to do two things. One was to talk about this book in the context of our work as psychoanalysts and our experience of analysis in our own analysis. And that's what I tried to do in my talk last time. But given the context for this meeting, what I decided I would like to do today is to put this work to use in trying to say something about civilization today dealing with the pandemic. And I have two things I want to say first to set this up. Two quotes, one short, one is a little longer. The first is from Éric Laurent's paper, The Real in the Group, where he discusses Lacan's experience in England with Bion and Rickman and so forth. And there it is, published in the psychoanalytics notebooks, and then published again, I think, in the psychoanalytical notebooks. So there's this wonderful quote by Laurent towards the end of the text: whether it be on a collective scale or for the individual, the psychoanalyst is defined as he who interprets. So we interpret in our practices, and we have the opportunity to interpret, as he puts it, on the collective scale. And this echoes Freud's own opinion about the value of psychoanalysis. And I want to read a paragraph from the Question of Lay Analysis, where Freud directly discusses this. He says, "For we do not consider it at all desirable for psychoanalysis to be swallowed up by medicine," he's talking about therapeutics here, "and to find its last resting place in a textbook of psychiatry under the heading Methods of Treatment, alongside of procedures such as hypnotic suggestion, autosuggestion, and persuasion," or CBT these days, "which, born from our ignorance, have to thank the laziness and cowardice of mankind for their short-lived effects. It deserves a better fate, and it may be hoped will meet with one. As a depth psychology, a theory of mental unconscious, it can become indispensable to all the sciences which are concerned with the evolution of human civilization and its major institutions, such as art, religion, and the social order. It has already, in my opinion, afforded these sciences considerable help in solving their problems. But these are only small contributions compared with what might be achieved if historians of civilization, psychologists of religion, philologists, and so on would agree to themselves to handle the new instrument of research which is at their service. The use of analysis for the treatment of neurosis is only one of its applications. The future will perhaps show that it is not the most important one. In any case, it would be wrong to sacrifice all the other applications to this single one just because it touches on the circle of medical interests. So Freud, Freud thought very highly of the work he developed and believed that it could be put to use for other reasons, such as making sense of civilization or being able to grasp something that's happening in civilization or in art or religion and so forth. So I'm going to give what I think are maybe 7 propositions that I want to make about this pandemic we're going through from the context of Freud and then also Lacan, and how they and others since then, Jacqueline Miller, have mobilized Freud's way of what? Of taking into account how libido works within civilization, in introducing a dimension to what we would have to say about society that did not exist before psychoanalysis. Yeah. So let's start with this. In what sense would we say that civilization's response to the pandemic follows the Freudian model, right? The purpose of civilization is to protect the members of civilization, protect against aggression, ensure safety, repress the desires, the libido of the members of civilization for some common good, unite people together, all of these principles that we've been reading about for the last couple months. How has that functioned in our world today? Do you see that anywhere today? I would assert that probably the most clear example of that we've seen globally is in New Zealand, which is a very interesting case. In New Zealand, a single leader, Jacinda Ardern, was a woman, and I'll have more to say about that in a second, was able to effectively do that, to take charge in this manner, ensure safety, shut the country down in a way that was more stringent than I believe anything else that I'm aware of. And in doing so, essentially at this point, eradicate the virus. People had to stay at home. There were very strict orders put in place, and she proved to be an effective master in a very classical sense and got the support of the citizens of New Zealand to do this. It's, in my mind, it's quite remarkable. She had done the same thing several years before. For people who follow his politics, there was a shooting in Christchurch, can't remember, a couple years ago, and a year ago, and she, it was a racially motivated shooting, and she was able to pull the country together at the same time. And she's a rather progressive figure, a prime minister, and one may make different points about the uniqueness of the New Zealand political structure that enables her to do this, but nonetheless, she achieved it. And what's interesting to me about this is that she did it in a very unique way. She's a young woman. She had a baby during the course of her term as prime minister. There was a lot of attention given to that, and some people were discrediting her ability to lead effectively. But she led through that through a very unique utilization of Facebook, videos that she would do to the entire country. And it's interesting when one looks across the globe at which leaders have been most effective in their countries in taking charge in this very classical sense and eradicating the violence. It's been women. Jacinda in New Zealand, and probably in Europe, the example would be Angela Merkel. And I think Germany's been very successful as well. And it speaks perhaps to a comment that from a text that I'll touch on later, when Jacqueline comments about the shift of our civilization from a civilization of based on the masculine logic of for all to the feminine logic of the not all. He comments on the feminization that's occurred in sort of public discourse and how values such as compassion, which are a hallmark of Jacinda's approach, will now become much more important socially. So I think if we're gonna take this sort of very simple version of Freud's hypothesis around social order and civilization in response to the pandemic, we can see that it applies in this case, it seems to me, fairly clearly. That's proposition one. Proposition two is that it's not always the case. You'll note that for Freud, the part of the fact of the functioning of civilization, the way he describes it, is through the superego, through the leader as the father, the importance of the father for Freud, and through the identification the individual will come to have with the father through love. It's the mechanism of love that's a kind of driving force for this. But Lacan, of course, even very early in his work, pointed out that while paternal identification with love may have a factor in social organization, that it may not be love that is the most important factor, but hate. Hate in the formation of groups. This is a point Lacan made in, I think it's the 40s, in the paper on logical time, where Lacan makes the proposition that that I achieve an identification not based on a positive attribution of the thing which I identify with, but rather on the basis of a negative attribution. He says, and this is a quote from Écrit, says, "A man knows what not a man is. Men recognize themselves among themselves as men, and I declare myself to be a man for fear of being convinced by men that I am not a man." It's worth reading. It's a very interesting proposition by Lacan around group formation not organized through love, but hate.
Can you give us the page, Tom?
174.
Thank you.
In English. And, you know, I think Éric Laurent has used that passage to say some things about the force of racism today in society. And I think we can also see this operative in politics. The success of the current American president in 2016 was a shock to people. But the discourse based on being an American by very clearly defining what not an American is was the logic that propelled the current president to office. And it's not a unique thing to the Republicans, because Bernie Sanders, for those who follow American politics, did the exact same thing. He said, what we're for is not being the 1%. So yeah, we're against the 1%ers. We're for everyone else in America because the 1%ers are not part of what this country is about. The campaign built on positive identification, which was the Hillary Clinton campaign, failed. We see this in the pandemic now. In play, at least in the United States, I don't know how this is formulated in Europe, but at least there are many people in the United States, and this came through very early on, where it was a foreign issue. The pandemic was an issue of it's a Chinese infection, and the entire logic of how the country was brought together for some people in responding to the pandemic was as if it's dealing with a foreign threat. So you can see the role of hatred or negative identification in play. This isn't something that it's affecting us all and we need to come together to deal with it. This is something from outside that we need to respond to. All right, that was my second proposition. Third proposition. And here I don't know the situation in other countries as well as the US, but I'll say this about the US. There's so many people speaking about what's going on and what to do. We have the president. There's some governors that are very prominent: Cuomo in New York, Whitmer in Michigan, Hogan in Maryland, Neus in California, who have frequent press conferences or quoted. We have Fauci, who most people probably know our most prominent medical expert, and BRICS. Bill Gates has offered opinions. The economists, Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Bank, and Mnuchin. So as one follows the discourse about the pandemic, all these figures are speaking and claiming to have authority, regarding what to say about this and how to protect the country. And it's banter back and forth, incessant buzzing of one person, then the other, then the other, then the other. And it occurred to me in thinking about this discord, this lack of a consensus in this country, at least the United States, about what to deal with this, that it was like we have all these different figures competing to be the S1. We have a swarm of wannabe S1s all buzzing with all their talk about this and that and the other. And it's what I would say an example of what we refer to in theoretical terminology as a pluralization of the name of the Father. There is no name of the Father operative right now in American discourse. And instead, you've got all kinds of figures out there buzzing away, trying to take that position. And indeed, that was my third point. What this shows, in fact, is the fourth point, which is the place of the S1, the place of the name of the Father as a central point in social discourse, at least in the United States, is gone. It can't be occupied in that sense anymore. And in part, it is that absence, that lack of it, that leads to something that got discussed in one of our meetings before, which was a kind of nostalgia for a strong figure to come forward and take that. And in the cases where that does happen, and it's happened not just in the US, but in other countries globally, in the cases where that happens, we see that it's never a symbolic father, that you could say, that comes to fill this position, but a kind of real father, a père jouisseur of sorts, who comes in and is seen as strength. It's not the person of a type like FDR or Charles de Gaulle or something like that. Fourth point. Point number 5. And in all these points, what I'm trying to do is take these issues of the signification and meaning and authority and libido, and show how they get reworked differently and the ways in which our civilization might be like what Freud described and ways in which it isn't. So what else do we see a lot of today with regard to the pandemic in civilization? It's a turn to experts, to scientists, to public health officials, in the face of a kind of lack of knowledge around what's going to happen. There's a turn to knowledge to take the dominant place. And as Laurent has commented somewhere, said if Freud was the one who highlighted the way in which jouissance is attached to the S1, it was Lacan who identified the way in which jouissance is linked to S2, to knowledge. And his notion in the development of the discourse theories in Seminar 17, I think highlight this the most, where knowledge is in the dominant place. And I think there's a discourse that exists socially with regard to the pandemic that wants that to happen. People want the experts to be in the position to give the orders and to structure society. For Lacan, this is something he probably got from Kojève, which is with his discussion in his work about the development of bureaucracy and so forth. And I think this discourse is in place now in society and in our response to the pandemic, a desire for a discourse of the university. And I'll give a very particular vignette about this. I teach small groups in our medical school at Creighton. And some teachers in a class that I facilitate put together a case vignette for small groups of students to work through. What would you do if you only have one ventilator and you have these different kinds of patients come in? How do you make your decision about who would get the ventilator and who would not? And it's the intent of the exercise is to help students learn to struggle with hard, difficult decisions you would have to make as a physician. And the response to the students is interesting, but one thing that came through with a number of the students was, well, can't you just create a formula that will tell us what to do? Give us an algorithm that we can follow, where that algorithm would be the thing driving the decision, so that my subjectivity doesn't have to get implicated in the matter. And I think we see this a lot. And this is, I would say, an example of the way in which we see the discourse of the university operative in society today. So that would be, I guess, I lost count, maybe the fifth proposition. Sixth proposition. One very strong strain, at least in the United States, around the pandemic is we can't shut things down. Things need to keep moving. We need to get people working. You can't shut the economy down. The circulation needs to keep going. We need the people work. There's a strong belief among many people that in essence, the circulation of goods, we could say, might even be more important, and to end the circulation of goods may be a worse thing to happen than to have deaths from the pandemic. It's quite obvious, or clear to me at least, that this is a case where we see the discourse of the capitalist in play. Lacan, in addition to the four major discourses he developed in Seminar 17, in a few talks he gave in Italy in the early 70s, developed a fifth discourse that he played with for a few years called the discourse of the capitalist.
It's not a discourse. It's a pseudo discourse, and maybe later we can discuss what that means.
That'd be fine. Where the points of the subject and the S1 are inverted, and there's a constant cycling. And I think it's important to recognize that discourse or pseudo discourse has an operative force in the response to the pandemic. Next point. The in a talk in 2004 that Miller gave in Comandatuba, he talked about how, in hearing these cases at the Congress, at that particular Congress of the WAP, you know, so many of the cases within the, you know, the discourse of the cases that were being presented, these were not classical neurotics, where an identification with the father was the key issue, but rather the object A was in the position of dominance within the discourse of these cases. He called these cases, the people were like with rudderless, without a compass, disoriented. And he introduced a proposition that I think is, you know, pretty provocative, which is one in which he states that the discourse of civilization today is no longer structured, as in Freud's time, on the model, you would say, of the discourse of the master, but in a sense, closer to the discourse of the analyst. Recall from the development that Lacan made about discourse theory was the notion was that the discourse of the master, in essence, was the structure of the unconscious in the Freudian moment. And that, in the sense, the discourse of the analyst was the opposite, the flip side, or the inverse, or the opposite of the discourse of the master, and could have an operation on the discourse of the master. The hypothesis that we could say is that there's a kind of continuity between the discourse of the unconscious and the discourse of the other, the world around in which people live. So if we take Miller's point in 2004 that the discourse of the unconscious is no longer structured like it used to be on this Freudian model with the importance of repression, but and rather the jouissance, surplus jouissance, the object A is in the dominant position. It implies that the unconscious is a different unconscious, but it also implies that that's true of the world around us. That if the S1, as I commented earlier, is no longer in the position of mastery, then it's the objet A that is in the position of what Miller called the social zenith. And I think my impression in thinking about the pandemic is, in a sense, that's the case. There seems to be no, the words Miller uses at the beginning of this paper, rudderless, disoriented, without a compass. These are the words we could use to describe, in the United States at least, the response to the pandemic. You know, it's one thing, and then the next week it's the other thing. There seems to be no clear direction given to what to do. You could compare this to FDR and Roosevelt and his leadership of the United States during the Depression and World War II, where they tried things and they would try them and not everything worked, but there was a clear direction that was being taken. There was an ability to unify the country, and we don't see this in the United States at all. Things are very disorganized in the response to the pandemic, and it makes me wonder if indeed that's not a function of what's going on. And you know, Miller says, you'll recall in this paper, that it's not that the civilization has the structure of the discourse of the analyst. because the connections aren't made, the things aren't articulated. It just approaches it, or it's like that. And I think that's another factor, at least in the United States, with what we are seeing now. And then finally, I want to offer a few remarks that Jacqueline made also around that same time in 2002 in the Milanese Intuitions, that I think very directly address the Freudian text. He says, for example, looking at the issue of the relationship of politics to the unconscious, the Freudian proposition is that politics is unconscious. And he says, yeah, that's fine. And for Freud, it was all based on this model of identification with the father, repression, and so forth. But Miller is keen to point out that politics is more than that. It's not just this unconscious element. And as I said earlier, we can see that it's not all about love and positive identification, but negative identification, as Lacan introduced. The second hypothesis is that the unconscious is politics, in the sense that the unconscious is the discourse of the other, as I said before. But that discourse may not be structured in the way it was in Freud's moment. And I think our civilization is not that of Freud's, for the most part. The third point he makes is an interesting one, which is he says the city doesn't exist. A certain model of civilization, of an imaginary homogeneous space along the lines of what they had in ancient Greece. The next point he makes is interesting. In a section called Freud and Queen Victoria, where he says that this repressive model is no longer the case. And he contrasts Queen Victoria with Queen Catherine Milot, who had just written a book, I think at that moment, I think it's called The Sexual Life of Catherine Milot, in which she documents, and it's an interesting read, in great detail, her sexual life. This is not a moment of repression in the Freudian sense. And he talks about the different relationship in Lacan between the signifier and jouissance. The signifiers, the symbolic was a kind of set in contrast to jouissance in the Freudian model. The signifiers killed the drive. But we see now, that the signifiers are a carrier of jouissance, we could say, that they carry jouissance in the symbolic. And there's no longer also this classical opposition between pleasure and jouissance. So that, the propositions in this chapter 8 about the relationship of the different drives, eros and aggression, and the way, and all of Freud's model about how these metamorphize, I don't think it doesn't work that way anymore. I don't think this is operative as much as it was before. And he says that now, Miller goes on to say, we're in an era of the not all. Where the universal masculine logic of Seminar 20 defining society is no longer the case, but there's no limits. It's no longer a structure with a limit and an organization and a hierarchy, but we're in a different era with the rise of the values of the feminine, as I indicated, and both an attack of a culture of masculine virility and a nostalgia to bring that back. A loss of master narratives, and there's no master narrative about the pandemic, and impairments in the social bond. I mean, which is all over the place. There were riots all across the United States last night over a tragic killing of a African-American in Minneapolis a couple days ago. So what now in this moment? I think we see different configurations socially, country by country, state by state, around how things are pulled together. You can have, on the one hand, a figure like the President of the United States. On the other hand, you can have somebody like Boris Johnson in England, and Macron in France, Merkel in Germany, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Each one of these figures pull different elements, I think, together and create very contingent structures for society. So those were my remarks. It's a little bit of a different kind of reading that I wanted to make. I wanted to open up a space for maybe a different kind of discussion and for comments from different people that would take this work of Freud's, take our approach as psychoanalysts to civilization, and introduce maybe the possibility of saying some different things about the pandemic through our perspective of psychoanalysis, none of which we could have done without Freud. He paved the way for thinking about civilization in this way. And I tried to, with these propositions, to at least open a dialogue on how we might say some things here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think it's, as you say, it's a different reading. I'm sure that there are of the text that people will have questions about and commentaries to make. So we're going to introduce a little change in our format today. You are probably already seeing that some others are coming onto your screen. We've decided to invite our commentators and our readers who participated during this 8 meetings to be present with us and to contribute to this conversation. Also, we're very much looking forward to what all the participants may have to say. I invite you to send your questions or commentaries through the question and answers box, so that the chat can remain as our wonderful space for exchanging in a more free associative way. So I'm delighted to welcome Joanne Conway, Raphael Montague, Gustavo de Sal, Susan McFeely, Neus Carbonell, Roger Litten, Caroline Heanue, Tom Ryan. I don't see Linda Clarke, yeah, there, and sorry, Sheila Power. We have apologies from Veronique Voruz, who sent her warmest regards to you all. She couldn't join us today. We already have a couple of questions in the question and answers box. So I might start with that, if that's okay, unless there's a pressing remark or comment that anybody would like to make from our panel.
Question for Tom, but it can wait.
Okay.
Okay.
That's fine. I also have a question which I consider it's quite pressing, but I'll make it work. I'll make it wait for a little while. Sorry, I'm trying to open my boxes here. We have a question from Marina. I think that Freud, still contemporary, talks about the superego regarding the modern discourse of the master, the capitalist discourse. He mentions in the last paragraph, men have gained control. So I presume it's the last paragraph of the reading of today. Let me go back to it to refresh people. No, I can't find it. Okay, could Thomas comment on this and the economical depression nowadays? In Greece, only the huge businesses remain open. For example, does this have to do with the feminization that Thomas mentioned? Okay, that's one question. Then we have a question from Itzel Perez. What is implied by using the term discourse? And a question by Simon Western. What do you think about society's reaction to the return to prohibition? For example, the lockdown, a return to the law of the father. Okay. So Thomas, maybe you want to begin by responding to one or several of this, of your choice.
Okay, I'd be happy to, but I'm also interested in hearing what my fellow
Panelists.
analysts have to say about these questions. So I'll just let me take the one about the lockdown, which is interesting because I think the lockdown was very implemented in very different ways across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it could be understood in the classical Freudian sense of the country or the state as the father protecting the citizens through control and forcing abandonment of your wish to travel freely and go to restaurants and whatnot. I think part of it can be understood through this issue of the university and the turn to public health experts and in putting knowledge in this place where, well, we have to do it because it's what the experts say to do. So I think that has a factor in it. But the fact that in the U.S. at least it was very, very partial is a function of, I think, a kind of almost competition of these discourses in play. The business people want their businesses to stay open. People don't want to make any sacrifices and want to continue to be able to do what they want to do. And in the US, I don't know if people appreciate being able to do what I want to do means showing up at the state capitol with machine guns and going in the building to protest the lockdown. I mean, in the US, it's a big deal. And there were people who said, I'm not going to do it. No one's taking this away. This is US. This is my freedom. I'd rather die. I'd rather die than survive. And this type of attachment to a kind of objet, in my mind, is a refusal to submit to an S1 is a strong feature of the American response to this. So in my mind, we can see all these things in play, very heterogeneous picture, depending on where you look.
I see that Gustavo has his hand up, very organized and polite. Gustavo.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thomas, good morning. Thank you very much for your 7 propositions. I found them really interesting. I think they open many things to figure out, to think, to elaborate. A few days ago, I read, I think it was on The Atlantic, the newspaper. Maybe you read it also. A very interesting article entitled The Rise of the American Idiot. I found that there is a very interesting connection between what you've said about the way the pandemic is being managed in the United States and this article, because I wonder if, given the fact that the legitimate authority no longer exists, or maybe let's rather say it's in a state of extinction, if this new S1, the idiot, as a new S1, of course, I take it as a metaphor of what is happening not only in the United States, of course, but that it's globally expanding. The idiot as a new S1. This is the first thing I would like to say. And
Gustavo,
yes,
would that be in the sense of the idiots of jouissance? In the etymological sense, the idiots of jouissance, the solitary idiots of jouissance.
yes, maybe, yeah. Yeah, a good remark. Thank you, Roger. Yeah. Yes. And concerning what you said about knowledge in the place of the agent, is interesting because not only in the United States, but in many other countries, society is divided concerning that. Divided in the sense that there are those who trust in knowledge, for example, in knowledge of science, and those who not, those who mistrust knowledge as something that can take over and give the order. Well, thank you so much, Thomas, once again.
Yeah. Can I make one response to that? Thank you, Gustavo. I'm going to chase that article down. I have not read it yet. I like this idea of the idiot as an S1, although I would say it's an S1 attached to some component of jouissance, as Roger pointed out. It's not an S1 as a pure symbolic, but it's rather a kind of it's a S1 linked with jouissance in some unique way. I think to your comment about the discourse of the university, you know, what we see is what the discourse of the university generates is split subjects. So in the position of, you know, the S2 acts on the objet A, and the product in the position of, I think it's called product in seminar 17, in the lower right hand corner of the quadrant in the discourse theory, you have the subject. And I think that's a function of the discourse of the university, is a kind of splitting of the subject that the subjects don't like. Because it implies you know, some kind of loss or division in that discourse. And in my mind, that's part of what that reaction is. And that reaction is strong in the US. There's a huge amount of skepticism of expertise on the part of people in the United States.
Can I join in on that for a moment?
Yes.
Thank you. I think, firstly, thanks to Linda for a wonderful reading, and thanks very much to Thomas for those 7 propositions. What you say about a particular response in certain, let's say, elements of society in the US, those that tend to be heavily armed, let's say, other than the US military, those that tend to be heavily armed, responds directly to Lacan's proposition with respect to alienation and forced choice, no? It's your freedom or your life. So, as Marie-Hélène Bruce points out in a recent contribution to Le Quotidien, the only thing that's guaranteed in this forced choice is a loss. This is what Lacan says in Seminar 11. It's interesting to me to refer Seminar 11 back to this particular chapter of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. So Freud speaks about, he doesn't speak about unconscious guilt. He speaks about an unconscious sense of guilt. It's not at all the same thing. And I'm responding in part to one of the comments here that we had. So to me, and this is something that Freud repeats, it's always when he says it, it's an unconscious sense of guilt. And to me, what we're talking about then is in relation to meaning. It's a sense in terms of the signifying chain and in terms of the subject of the unconscious, where the only thing that's guaranteed in alienation in terms of subject construction is this loss we speak about of the forced choice, your freedom or your life. But Freud introduces then a topographical variety of anxiety into his equation. And he's speaking about then symptom as substitute for satisfaction that remains in abeyance. But is it a sexual satisfaction? So Freud says in terms of the drive trend, and this is why seminar 11 on the 4 fundamental concepts is important here. Freud says that it's libidinal elements that turn out to be repressed. And what are these libidinal elements? Well, Lacan will say the only thing that is repressed are signifiers. So you see, the libidinal elements are bits of signifiers. Then we come to separation, which is what we can refer to what's missing in the signifying chain, of which the subject is the simple effect, or where is the missing signifier in the locus of the other, in terms of the discourse of the unconscious. So this topographical variety of anxiety, if we read Lacan in seminar 10, anxiety is not without an object. But what is it that's called up in the signifying chain between S1 and S2, in the void, in the gap, in the signifying chain? The vanishing of the subject, but where's the anxiety? The subject called up as object, an impossible object. And you see then why, for Freud, you run into a problem in terms of analysis interminable, because the jouissance, the sense in terms of signifiers that don't mean anything, that have to be deciphered, is S1 a link to S2, which is an indefinite calling up of anxiety in relation to jouissance. And
there's something interesting there in one of the questions by a participant as well, how to conceive of guilt and remorse nowadays. I was thinking in what Gustavo was bringing with this idea of the jouissance of I heard it as the jouissance of the idiot, even though Gustavo brings it as an S1, but it's a problem that the S1 has different statuses in Lacan's work. And the S1, even though we think about it very quickly as the master signifier, it's not only that, but perhaps Thomas or others would like to say something about what Raphael was bringing in terms of the sense of guilt, the unconscious sense of guilt nowadays.
Well, Gustavo wrote a beautiful short reflection in Spanish that we translated also, no? Gustavo, the I don't know how you say in English, delincuentes, the delinquents, by sense of the solitude. It's a beautiful, if you can translate it into English, I find that very beautiful article. And Gustavo, you there comment on the 2 kinds of leaders that we have nowadays. The leaders that are perhaps neurotic and have a certain sense of guilt, and the perverted ones, right? And I found that very interesting reflection when we talk about politics nowadays. And also perhaps in these same lines, the fact that the last paragraph of the chapter today that I think was added later by Freud, and it was at the dawn of the Second World War. It's a very I find that paragraph to be especially I don't know how to say, but it causes me a certain emotion, right, to read that paragraph.
It is very moving.
It's
Yes.
very moving last paragraph if we think of the historical moment in which Freud added that paragraph. And it's amazing, really, that there Freud talks about the power of distraction of civilization. And I think that what this pandemic is bringing out is that this power of distraction is even higher nowadays, because this pandemic brings about how the entire planet can be put under the yoke of death, because everything is together in this pandemic. The climate change, the corruption with sanitary goods, the individualism, everything with this pandemic is bringing out probably the worst of human beings. But anyway, I wanted to make an emphasis on this last paragraph, and also this distinction that I found very fine that Gustavo makes, that we cannot think of all political leaders the same way, and how this having a sense of guilt or not having a sense of guilt changes.
I'm going to give the floor to Joanne, and then we have a question from Renata. We probably will take 2 or 3 questions, comments. So raise your hand or write your question, and we'll bring then the conversation to a close. Joanne.
Thanks, Florencia, and thank you, Thomas and Linda, for today. And I suppose it's a comment, or I'm trying to clarify something, and it echoes a little bit what Neus was saying when you spoke about politics and the rise of the feminine. And you cited 2 women politicians. And my question is in relation to what you were saying about the different forms of leaders that Neus has just mentioned. And my question is something around, can politics have any place for the not all? I mean, is this not in a complete opposition, the one to the other? That politics, how does that fit with what you say in terms of the rise of the feminine? That was my question.
I'll just say something very briefly. First, on the issue of guilt, I would agree. There are probably leaders where guilt is a strong factor, and there are probably some leaders where we don't see a lot of guilt at all. So absolutely. And you could do interesting things with that. I think the point that and this was a point from Jacqueline that I was bringing into my talk, was the notion that if society is no longer structured under a universal masculine logic, but more under this logic of the not all, using this Seminar 20 formulation as a way of saying something about society, he linked that with a kind of decline in the kind of classical notion of masculine virility, along with a desire to return to it and find it again, and with a change, I think you could almost say it, a change in the style or the character of discourse in the direction of one that includes things that he described as more classical feminine values like compassion and so forth. And I would think that it's very possible that in as much as these terms have a lot of utility for us anymore, this sort of masculine, feminine, because I think even those are in flux as well. But But I would say that there are leaders, some leaders in the United States, at least, governors, executives, mayors, where being compassionate, being willing to show emotion, being willing to be thoughtful about others, to cry in public, these kinds of things that 50 years ago would have been seen as inconceivable in a political leader, you see now in political discourse. And they can be, and I think the interesting thing about the Prime Minister of New Zealand is that you could have those traits. She was very open in talking about her pregnancy and having a young child, and very, talked very openly about that. But you can have those traits in a leader who is also very strong. It's sort of in the classical sense, in being able to organize society and get things done and have an impact. It unlinks, in my mind, a kind of stereotypical version of masculine feminine from the notion of being able to occupy a position of S1 and order things. Let's put it that way.
So a leader has to be a human being.
Well,
not necessarily.
Well, attempt to be, maybe.
We have Roger, who's raised his hand.
Yes. I just wanted to just make a couple of comments, getting back to what Gustavo said, but just picking up on what Joanne and Thomas and Neus said earlier about the two modes of leaders. Maybe one version would be leaders without guilt and leaders, but the one commodity we don't seem to have much on about with leaders is shame. Maybe we shouldn't forget, while focusing on this question of guilt, guilty leaders are not necessarily any more useful to us, but we can ask what happened to any leader with a sense of shame. And we see in this chapter something about the relation between guilt and anxiety as topological related, but we could ask, what about the role of shame in the modern configuration? And we hope where we're going with seminar 17 to the question of shame in the last chapter.
Absolutely, yeah.
That we'd find that. So that, then, because otherwise we fall into this idea of, let's say, character types of leaders. You have the strong, virile leader, or you have the caring, compassionate, feminine leader. And as both Joanne and Thomas pointed out, the dangers you fall into kind of binary stereotypes of womanly virtues and virile virtues. Whereas maybe it's more useful to try to think about places that can be occupied within the discourses of the all and the not all. Including, it's not just which kind of leaders do we get, but which places are available for leaders to occupy within the configuration of current discourses. Which also reminds us that, let's say, the all and the not all are not binary exclusive logics. They're logics that are dynamically articulated in exactly the same way that the masculine and the feminine are not separate. It's an articulation between the two, which prevents us falling into simplistic binaries. In relation to that question of using the mapping of the all and the not all to just, I did want to take up what Gustavo said about the idiot. And this idea of the idiots of jouissance was precisely a comment on the jouissance of the idiot. Because we see, otherwise idiot just seems, well, it's a term of insult because we don't agree with these guys because they have low IQ. That's not the point. I think the strong sense of the idiots of jouissance is including, shall we say, because the thing that strikes me about the whole chapter, not just this chapter, but the whole thing, is how Freud locates the operator of renunciation as the central articulator between the individual and civilization. Mm-hmm. And there we can situate what falls under prohibitive culture is all the operators of negation that operate the interface between signifier and jouissance, let's say civilization and the individual. Whether it's renunciation, sacrifice, castration, prohibition, etc. If we situate the permissive society in contrast to the prohibitive, we see it's not about permission, in contrast to the prohibitive, it's because the operators of negation no longer function. So whereas before it would be the good of all comes above the happiness of the individual. That's the model Freud's working in Civilization. It's the Victorian model of prohibition, censorship, renunciation, and castration. Now we have, and it's presumably associated with the neoliberal discourse, we have individual right to jouissance, my right to bear arms in the government buildings, and my right to die of the virus if I wish to, and endanger everybody else, because my individual right to jouissance is unchallenged. Mm-hmm. And it's not clear what the operator is that can challenge my individual right to jouissance, which has, let's say, been supported by 3 centuries of the neoliberal discourse. So whereas before, civilization depends on the individual renunciation of happiness in order to reclaim it in the guise of the all. Now suddenly we have the individual idiots of jouissance, but the question of how those rights are going to be articulated in the frame of some greater good that would be a viable civilization suddenly becomes a question that we haven't solved.
We haven't indeed, and we won't today.
And it's interesting how the pandemic then forces that question to the fore, because the pandemic is not something that can be solved in terms of individual rights to jouissance, nor the individual right to, it's something that requires a collective solution. But we don't have collective operators that might actually allow us to address those questions.
Thank you, Roger. I'm going to give the floor to Susan. And Gustavo, did you want to speak as well? No, okay.
Really, my comment, I have to say, I'm just conscious we're coming close to time. And my comment is really more about this invention of civilization and its discontents, and into the particular time that we have all found ourselves on, as Neus has spoken of, very much at the yoke of death at times, but in particular where each one of us have been confronted with our own maybe relationship to solitude or that. And I suppose I wanted to thank you, Florencia, and ICLO, of course, for this invention, because it has in a sense supported all of us to remain awake, to not cover, and to confront and to step out of our solitude at times. And my second comment is about a reader. It was an interesting invention for us to think of reading out loud. And for me, it was one of the most fantastic experiences. And I wanted to thank you for that. And in fact, it really made me think very long and hard about, in fact, the solitude of reading silently sometimes. So thank you so much for that. Okay.
I thank you, Susan, as well, and everyone who participated in this reading seminar. The first one, when we started, I personally didn't even know what Zoom was. I had to go to Google and find out what this platform was, how it worked. This could not have been possible without Linda Clarke, who has given many hours to figuring things out, but also who did a beautiful reading today, which is a great way to conclude this initiative, this adventure. We've met a lot of new people along the way. I'm delighted for that. We've connected with parts of the world where I didn't even know psychoanalysis was in existence in such a lively way. And I think we can take this as the beginning of what the contingency has allowed us to encounter. We go back to Neus' first commentaries in terms of the price to be paid, the loss to be admitted, and the gain, because that's what the loss makes possible. So I thank you very much for being there. These meetings will be published in the form of the recording videos online on the ICLO website, but everyone who paid with their presence, with their bodies, with their voice, with their words in the commentaries, in the questions and answers, will know that that gives something extra. So thank you very much, and see you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.